All right, so here we are. We are going to finish up the part of chapter 35 on the birds as well as the mammals. For those of you in the morning section, you've already seen the birds part of this lecture, but for those in the afternoon, this will be new. Morning section, feel free to go ahead and skip through this if you'd like, or if you're really up to punishing yourself, you can watch it again. The birds are going to be the second most diverse group of vertebrates that we've seen. Fishes, of course, are number one, over 35,000 species or so. The birds are upwards of about 8,600 species. But again, we know this group really, really well. There are so many people out there that really like to watch birds and study birds that it's quite likely that not a huge number of new species of birds are out there waiting to be described. In this group, very likely the reason why it is so diverse is because the birds were able to exploit a habitat that was not really being used by many other terrestrial vertebrates, that of course being the aerial type habitat for the most part. And of course, very much tied to that is the fact that they do have feathers. Um, these, what are essentially very, very advanced reptiles, have several traits of their ancestors. They have an amniotic egg, much like reptiles still do. They have very, very scaly legs. If you ever see or picture the foot of a chicken or most other birds, they have scaly legs. They, however, don't have teeth, which is something that sets them apart from the reptiles. In the morning section, we talked about why having teeth might be a disadvantage or a drawback for a bird. Teeth are heavy, and so if you're a bird who's all about saving weight in order to get to be in the air, get into the air, stay in the air, and not burn up too much energy, saving on weight is an absolute must. They also don't have a bony tail. Now, of course, many birds do have tail feathers, but it's not actually the fact that there is a structure of muscle and bone below that tail, or below those feathers, as most reptiles do. So we have feathers. Feathers are just very, very highly modified scales. Of course, now for a lot of birds, they help generate lift, but initially at least, they probably were there to help reptiles, the earliest bird-like reptiles, conserve heat. They were there for thermoregulation. You can imagine a reptile that very much dependent on the environment to maintain its body temperature, cannot really generate enough metabolic heat to keep itself warm in cold weather. All of a sudden, if it had some insulation, if it had a new kind of scale, which certainly didn't look anything like a flight feather that we see today, but more like a down feather, even something simpler than that, it might help them maintain heat, move into maybe slightly cooler climates, and eventually be used for flight. In the morning section, we also talked about something called pre-adaptation, where species develop a trait which later on in their evolutionary, I guess, future, they're able to use that trait to do something else. It's pre-adaptation. It's not so much that they were trying to develop a trait so that they could have one later on in the future to use, but a pre-existing trait was there and available to be used or co-opted for some new kind of a feature. The skeleton is very unique as well. Very thin bones, for the most part, are hollow, although they do have a lot of reinforcing cross struts almost on the inside to help reinforce them and give them strength. A lot of fusion of bones. If we look at the sternum, for example, the sternum is very, very well developed. It's what we call a keeled sternum, and it's a place where those pectoral muscles or breast muscles attach in those birds. The breast meat that you eat when you eat chicken breast is attached to a very, very highly keeled sternum. A lot of surface area for attachment to provide power on the downstroke for these birds as they fly. So like we said, these are modified reptile scales. They're keratin based, just like a reptile scale, just like your fingernails or just like your hair for that matter, same kind of a protein. They are available to be sort of hooked together. This picture down here kind of shows you the overall structure of a feather. The long main axis, which is usually called a quill, in ornithological terms is actually referred to as a rachis, R-A-C-H-I-S. It has these sort of side branches coming off of it, again of keratin, which are called barbs. So the side branches are called barbs, and each side branch has a side branch that are called barbules. Those barbules very often are hooked, and they can actually cross-link to each other, and almost like Velcro hold the overall structure of the feather together, which is really, really handy. You want to have a continuous structure so that you don't have gaps, and that could cause problems for both thermoregulation and for flight. So the forelimbs primarily are for flight. For flightless birds, things like ostriches, it's going to be more of a balancing structure as they run or as they walk. For birds that are things like penguins that actually swim around underwater, they're used for flight, but now underwater as opposed to above land. If you ever watch a penguin underwater swimming, they're flapping their wings just like a bird in the air. The wings aren't powerful enough to get them into the air on land, but underwater they do a great job of propelling the animal through the water, and the back feet can be used for steering. The back feet in birds is a lot more variable. There are birds that use their hind legs, their back legs for capturing prey, killing prey, any kind of raptor, falcon, hawk, eagle, osprey, those kinds of things are going to have killing kinds of talons on the back legs. You can have birds that use their feet for perching. A lot of the really common songbirds, biggest order of birds, are called the passeriformes, which are perching birds. Other birds use their back legs for swimming. Think about ducks and geese and those kinds of things. So lots and lots of possibilities for functions of those hind legs. The front legs, of course, are there for flight, and it's more of a consistent nature among this particular structure in a lot of birds is using the front legs for flight. This is the first known bird-like reptile from the fossil record. It's a very, very old one. There have since been some found that were older, but they were, of course, more reptilian since they were older. This is a transitional form between reptiles and birds. This animal, if you'll notice on this picture, you can't really see them so much here, but the fossil did show very, very strong evidence of having teeth, which is something that reptiles almost always have and birds pretty much never have, so that's kind of a reptilian trait. It also has a long bony tail complete with vertebrae running all the way back here to the tip, so again, very much a reptilian type trait. But on the other hand, in the fossil imprint, there is very, very strong evidence of feathers. So, okay, that's kind of different. That's something that most reptiles obviously don't have. So it kind of gives us a clue that maybe this was kind of a transitional form moving from reptile to bird, and it does look a lot like other theropod type ancestors. So as we've said, this pre-adaptation, feathers initially almost certainly were not used for flight. They were too simple. They were not big enough or rigid enough to sustain flight, to generate lift for what you need for flight. They were more like down, like you find in a down comforter or a down jacket. Those types of feathers aren't very strong. They're not rigid enough in order to be able to fly, but what do they do a great job of? Why do you have down in your comforter? Why do you have down in your jacket? It's a very, very good insulator, and so that's primarily the main reason why this structure was favored initially in evolutionary time. So we're actually going to go ahead and pretty much skip this slide. You see some very, very old groups here, theropod type things like we talked about on Thursday. Some other things like Velociraptor, right? You've probably heard of that one. That's Jurassic Park, raptor kind of fame there. And as we move along here, we start seeing things which are more and more like birds, right? From Caudipteryx to Archaeopteryx to eventually modern day birds, like the one in that picture there. All right, we're actually going to pretty much not talk about Confuciornis, which is another sort of older fossil found. We talked about some of the main flight structures. It's not just the weight saving, it's not just the hollow bones, it's also physiology. We have to have feathers to fly, you have to have hollow bones to fly, you have to save on weight to fly, but you also have to have the ability to maintain the energy you need to power flight. Flight is an extremely, extremely, extremely expensive activity energetically. Obviously, you can't stress that enough. They have to have very efficient blood flow. They have to have very efficient circulation. They have to have really, really efficient respiration. They've got some very unique structures, sort of going along with their lungs. Their lungs actually don't have alveoli like mammalian lungs do. They've got a series of other what are called parabronchi and air sacs in the body which maintain airflow. It's a very, very different kind of a setup than what we have, and unique to birds. We'll see it later on when we talk about birds in the respiration chapter. This picture here just kind of shows you that fossil imprint of Confuciornis. Down here you can see these long, what we would now call tail feathers, but again, very likely bones in that skull and other reptilian traits as well. So birds very much so are endothermic. If you ever get a chance to hold a live bird, they are very, very warm to the touch. Their body temperature is much higher than yours, and to do that, they have to maintain a very high metabolic rate. What does that mean? It means they need a lot of carbohydrate, they need a lot of oxygen, right? So birds have a very rapid metabolism. If you look at something like a hummingbird, you might see something in the neighborhood of hundreds of beats per minute. The heart is just cranking along as fast as it possibly can to maintain blood flow and maintain metabolism in those tiny little birds. Lots of heat loss too when you have that much surface area. So we talked about the hollow bones. We talked about the keeled sternum. There are other things like the furculum, F-U-R-C-U-L-U-M. It's much easier to write this on the board, isn't it? F-U-R-C-U-L-U-M, furculum, pretty much spelled like it sounds, which is the wishbone. This is a structure that when the bird provides power on the downstroke using its pectoralis muscles, the furculum is compressed just like a spring, and then when the bird relaxes those pectoral muscles, in part, that furculum decompresses and pushes outward, and that's going to help raise the wings up. Think about if you've ever lifted weights, or just thinking about it in general, if you take your arms and hold them out to the side, if you rotate them in front of you so they're sort of pointing in front of you, you get a lot more power moving that way. If you're doing chest flies on a weight machine, or if you're lifting, You can lift a lot more weight going from lateral position to arms in front of you than you can going back the other way. If you're doing reverse flies, you can't do nearly as much weight because the muscles in your shoulders pulling your arms back to the open position, like you're going to give somebody a hug, going from arms in front to arms to the side, those shoulder muscles are much smaller and much less powerful, so you can do much less weight. And birds are the same way. Most of their power comes on the downstroke, going from what was equivalent to us, arms out to the sides to arms pointed in front. They have a lot more power there than what they do in the opposite direction. So that furculum is like a compression, decompression device to help give them power to bounce those wings back up so that they can then do another downstroke. Respiration, like I mentioned, is to us very bizarre, but to them is very efficient and very, very effective. It's the most efficient respiration and the most efficient circulation of any animal is what we find in the birds. It has to be because they're burning through so many calories. They have to supply a lot of oxygen to do that. One other thing that comes up in this chapter is light versus dark meat. Right, this looks kind of good here. As I'm sitting here, it's right around lunchtime, and this looks pretty appetizing right now. Light meat and dark meat is kind of analogous to what we think of as being slow twitch and fast twitch muscle. Light meat is very much like fast twitch. Dark meat is very much like slow twitch. And if you know about those terms, slow twitch muscles are usually very powerful, typically pretty good at slow, sustained contractions for long periods of time. Not really so good at providing rapid bursts of power. Fast twitch muscles, on the other hand, are typically going to be shorter bursts of power. They don't have the stamina, but they can supply the energy you need, like right now. In the morning group, we talked about sprinters. Sprinters tend to have a higher proportion of fast twitch muscle than do long distance runners. Marathon runners tend to have a higher proportion of slow twitch muscles. And to a large degree, I mean, that can be affected by training, but to a large degree, that's genetic in basis as far as how much muscle of each type you have. In birds, you can very easily predict where a bird's going to have its dark meat or what you think of as slow twitch muscle. Whatever part of the bird they use the most, I think the greatest activity level, if they walk around a lot or if they run around a lot like a chicken or a turkey or something like that, they're going to have most of their dark meat in their legs and in their thighs because those are the muscles they need to have those slow, sustained contractions for long periods of time. Dark meat's going to have a lot of oil in it. It's going to have a lot of fat. It's going to have a lot of myoglobin. It's going to have a ton more mitochondria. All ways of either storing or burning energy to keep those muscles going for the long term. And a chicken or a turkey, they're not going to really use their pectoral muscles, their breast muscles so much. So that's going to be more white meat. Those are going to be rapid bursts of activity. Now domesticated things that we typically consume for food, are a bad example because they've been raised. They're so ridiculously geared toward just providing meat that you can't really even see how they function or would function in the wild anymore. But if you think about a wild turkeys can fly. For short distances, they have enough power in those pectoralis muscles to get them from the ground up into a tree to roost for the night. That's a very heavy animal to get up into a tree. You're talking, 10, 15 pounds maybe. Getting that off the ground into a tree using just the wings, that's a tremendous amount of power. Now, obviously, they can't maintain that for a long time. They're not migrating from here to Ecuador, but they can at least do short bursts of activity, like what you'd think of with a fast twitch muscle. So that's where you're going to find most of your fast twitch. If you think about something like a goose or a little songbird that migrates from here to someplace very, very far away, they're going to have a lot more dark meat up in their pectoralis muscles. Their breast meat would be a lot darker, a lot oilier, maybe to some people taste better, but also maybe not quite as good for you as well. But it's there for those slow, sustained contractions. The biggest group of birds, the biggest order of birds is the Passeriformes, like I mentioned before. There are about 28 orders of birds, going from the very ancestral ostrich-like or similar things that didn't really fly too much to eventually the water birds, ducks and geese and various waterfowl like that. And eventually today, the biggest order are the Passeriformes. Most of the birds that we are most familiar with, even things like, this isn't a blue jay, but this is a cousin of a blue jay, and this isn't an American crow, but it's a cousin of the American crow. These are both Passeriformes. Other little songbirds are here in the summertime and in the spring that sing pretty little songs, and males have bright colored feathers, and people like to watch them. Those are also many times Passeriforme birds. So it's by far the biggest group, and really the only order you definitely need to know about are the Passeriformes because it is such a dominant group. 60% of 8,500 species is quite a few species in that order. All right, so moving on to the mammals now. We're down to only about 4,500 species. This is actually the smallest group of vertebrates by species number. But in many cases a dominant group when it comes to impacts on the ecosystem. Not only us, but a lot of other mammals are kind of the dominant group. Of all the classes, we are the least species rich. And even within our group, most species are either rodents, bats, shrews, or moles. Rodents are in their own family. Rodents are in their own order. Bats are in their own order. Shrews and moles are in their same order together as well. Those are the most diverse groups of mammals. All right, so most successful. I've used that term a lot in the first part of this semester, and what I want to kind of do is go back and review what exactly that means. Success is kind of a matter of perspective. You could talk about the sheer numbers of individuals. Mammals aren't that. Nematodes and insects are by far more abundant in individual terms than anybody else. You could talk about number of species, right? So the mollusks and the arthropods have us beat there as well. But when you look at sheer ecological impact, collectively as a group, mammals are certainly right up there. So we are tetrapods, of course. We typically have 4 limbs. We have teeth that are set into jaws, so we're not like the chondrichthyes fishes, the cartilaginous fishes that have their teeth sort of scales very loose in the jaw. They break off very easy. Our teeth are very firmly set in jaws. We're endothermic, internal fertilization. Most of us are going to have fleshy external ears, the exception there being things that are largely fossorial, things that live below ground. Those external ears would kind of get in the way and kind of tend to get clogged up a little bit. So things like shrews and moles very often will have their external ears very much reduced and may even have ways of sealing off the ear canal while they're burrowing. Marine mammals do the same thing. Seals have very much reduced external ears to prevent water from getting into their ears. Typically covered with hair or fur of some kind. And again, this is very similar. This is a descendant or a remnant of a reptilian scale. It's keratin based. It comes from hair follicles. It's very much a similar function in some cases to feathers in birds. It can also be used in mating and protection of the body and display to attract mates, those kinds of things. So lots of functions here as well. Protection, like in this, looks like a porcupine kind of, or a hedgehog, but it's actually not. This is called a spiny echidna. So it's ECHIDNA, echidna. There's a few species of those in Australia, very odd egg-laying mammals, monotreme mammals, kind of like duck-billed platypus. And most mammals do have a placenta. And the placenta is, as we've kind of talked about before, it's an extension of one of those layers of the embryonic egg, the chorion. Eventually grows out into the endometrial layer of the mother's uterus and provides gas exchange and nutrient exchange and these kinds of things. Most mammals do this. Most mammals contain or have a connection between embryo and mom throughout most of their development. So it's going to nourish the embryo, nourish the offspring until it can be born and start to either be fed by mom or even fed by itself in some cases. The exceptions here to the placenta, again, are things like the echidna and the platypus, as well as the marsupial mammals, which are going to go through a completely different strategy of reproduction themselves. All right, so marsupial down here on this slide. This is some kind of marsupial inside of a pouch, so to speak. We'll talk about that strategy here in a second. We've got 4-chambered hearts. We've got very efficient negative pressure breathings. We have a diaphragm, which we can flatten out, expand the chest cavity, pull air in, and so forth. Mammals are dioecious. Most mammals are viviparous. 99% of mammals are viviparous. The only exceptions, again, being the echidna and the platypus. These are kind of your typical mammal traits, right? So the young are going to be nourished initially for varying lengths of time by the mother through secretions from mammary glands. This is going to provide nutrition, carbohydrates as well as fats, and in addition, immune support as well. It's going to help getting some of mom's antibodies into the embryo, so some protection from infectious agents there as well. Because mammals tend to be relatively large, and because mammals tend to use quite a bit of resources, mammals are one of the most sensitive groups to environmental impact. You think about some mammals that require huge areas, even tens or hundreds of square miles of home range. A pack of wolves or a few bears of some kind are going to require a huge amount of area. If you start reducing the habitat area because of human effects, that's going to have a really big impact on those species. They also tend to be the more K-selected species who are limited in growth rate and can only reproduce as fast as the resources of the environment can support them. So they don't tend to bounce back very quickly once you knock back their population some. Exceptions, again, being the very small mammals like rodents and so forth, which can bounce back pretty quickly. All right, so we've got sort of in some ways a very similar, in some ways a very different parallel to what we saw in the reptilian section of this chapter, talking about the embryonic layers, the amniotic egg. This situation here, we've got the same structures present, right? So we've got a chorion, which is involved in gas exchange and nutrient exchange with mom. It forms a placenta down here. We've got the umbilical cord, which kind of takes over the function of the allantois for the duration of pregnancy, as well as part of the feeding structure. The yolk sac down here, you notice the yolk sac is very, very small. We still produce a yolk sac during development, but it's very small, very rudimentary, almost more of a vestigial structure that's not used anymore. Not a real big functional impact of the yolk sac on the embryo and eventually the fetus. So the umbilical cord is going to be for feeding as well as waste disposal here for a little junior. We've got the amniotic layer, that's still there. Think about amniotic fluid right around the baby here, so providing, or the fetus, providing protection against impact or cushioning in a degree, so that's going to be pretty helpful there as well. All right, so taking a look now at the different groups of mammals. Mammals among animals have the most specialized of teeth. If you think about a reptilian mouth, think about a crocodile or a lizard's mouth, the teeth are pretty much all the same. They're kind of cone-shaped, broad at the base, narrow at the tip. They don't really have a whole lot of specialization of teeth. Mammals are not that way, right? So mammals, if you take a look at some representative mammals here, take a look at some things like, well, we got humans, which are very much omnivorous. We have all four kinds of teeth. We have teeth that are involved with grinding. These would be our molars and premolars. We have ripping teeth or tearing teeth. Those are going to be for your canines, essentially, for puncturing and shredding meat, basically. And then chiseling teeth are your incisors in the front, which are used for taking bites out of things. Think about taking a bite out of an apple. You use those incisors to rip off a chunk of apple or any kind of bite of food when you take a bite of food. It's your incisors that break it off from the rest. Look at an elephant down here. Right? The chiseling teeth, the incisors actually become the tusks. Very, very different function here than it is over here or in the beaver or in the dog or in the deer. Notice how there are none of those ripping teeth. The canines are pretty much not there at all. The rest of them are all grinding teeth, and that's not surprising because these are all herbivorous and they need to have a lot of flat surface area to grind up those very recalcitrant plant leaves so that they can begin to digest them eventually. The beaver up here, again, is a very similar story. We've got the incisors here in the front. We've got the molars here in the back, but there's really none in the way of canines up here. You don't find too many carnivorous beavers out there, so they don't really need to have those canines so much. And the same thing with the deer, right? We've got a whole bunch of molars. We've got some lower incisors. Notice how there aren't even any upper incisors up here. So deer, if you think about a deer's mouth, they don't really have much of the way of teeth in the upper jaw for incisors at least. So again, mostly herbivorous, lots of grinding flat teeth here to break up that plant matter. What about dogs? Right? Dogs are like the opposite of a deer or a beaver or an elephant because dogs, canids in general, not just dogs, but coyotes and wolves and those kinds of things, hyenas, are more, in fact, are completely carnivorous. So very sharp incisors for grabbing onto and subduing prey, canines for killing prey, molars and premolars, it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but are very much wedge-shaped or triangular shaped, so they can slice through the meat. They don't really have a need to do that flat grinding sort of activity because their food's very easy to break up. They don't need a lot of the way of molars like we have or like an elephant or a deer has because they're not consuming plant matter. Cats would be the same way. Felids, if you have a cat at home or if you have a dog at home, if they'll let you, take a look in their mouth, take a look at their teeth, and what you'll notice is they're all geared toward meat eating. There's really no plant function there at all. The other scenario that we have here is whether or not they consume plants when it comes to digestion. Things that eat a lot of plants, things that are strictly herbivorous, are going to have very, very long digestive tracts because it takes a lot of time to break down that food. We saw this with the gastric ceca and the grasshoppers before. They eat plants, very difficult to digest. They have to have a lot of time. It even helps to have chambers there to help ferment that plant matter, break down that cellulose, and actually get something good out of it. So they're going to have not only the long digestive tract, maybe even some microbial help in there to help break down that very recalcitrant cellulose and get some nutrients out of it. Things like dogs, things like foxes, things like cats, very, very short digestive tract because what they're consuming, in other words, meat, is very easy to break down. They don't need to have that long digestive tract to break down meat. Other structures here, we've got some things like hooves, which are essentially the same as your fingernails. They're keratin-based. Some animals have horns or antlers. If you know the difference between those, you know that horns are a permanent feature. They are keratin-based, again, just like hooves, same stuff as hooves, same stuff as your fingernails, but they're surrounding a bony core, and they don't ever come off on their own. Antlers, on the other hand, are made out of bone. So animals that produce antlers, like deer or elk, produce antlers only in the breeding season. Males produce in the breeding season. They fall off after the breeding season, and they have to regrow them the next year. Very difficult energetically, by the way. You can imagine using that much calcium, that much energy to build these antlers. It's going to take a lot out of them. It's actually a big draw on their bodies to produce those things. In very basic terms, horns are permanent, antlers are somewhat temporary. They come off after a while. As far as flying mammals, bats obviously are those. Flying squirrels and other similar things are gliding animals. Not exactly the same thing. It's not powered flight. It's more of a gradual falling or a controlled falling than it is flight. But bats are definitely flying. Comparing bats' wing structure to that of, say, a bird, very, very different scenario. Obviously, the feathers aren't there in the mammals, but even the bones inside of it, the parts of the wing that make up the internal support. If you see, I think the best one is this picture over here. This shot right here shows you in the forelimb, you've got humerus up here by the shoulder. You've got radius and ulna. These are the fingers. These little bones sticking out here are actually the fingers there over which this very thin skin is stretched to provide them an airfoil, to provide them the ability to make lift. In a bird, that's not the case. In a bird, they're actually going to have the membrane stretched over, or the wing is the entire arm, the entire forelimb. If you were to go back in time and look at something like a pterodon, they're even crazier. They have their wing is made mostly over their ring finger. The fourth digit is extremely, extremely long, like 50 times longer than the rest of the fingers. Maybe not quite 50, but a lot longer than the rest of the fingers. And their skin is stretched over that fourth kind of ring finger, and that's what they use for the bulk of their wings. So even though they all fly, they do so in very, very different ways. Bats, of course, also can use echolocation, kind of like sonar, but in the air. Little clicks and noises they make, they can perceive those as they bounce back off of obstacles or off of prey to allow them to avoid running into stuff and allow them to capture mosquitoes or whatever else they're eating. So mammals have been around for quite a while, 220 million years. Way, way before the end of the dinosaurs, or most dinosaurs. So we know that dinosaurs and mammals, early mammals, overlapped. Because mammals were at a bit of a disadvantage when it comes to size and, I guess, ferocity as well. They were very much nocturnal. They were very much small, probably very secretive and very shy, because if you were to come out during the daytime in the age of the dinosaurs, you probably weren't going to be around very long. That was going to be kind of a bad idea to come out when there were a lot of other big, hungry reptiles running around. So until the end of the Cretaceous, when we see the sort of beginning of the end of the dinosaurs, mammals were pretty small and pretty secretive. After the Cretaceous, moving into the Tertiary, as we see over here in this picture, from Cretaceous to Tertiary, mammals hit their peak abundance from 65 million to about 2 million years ago. All right, so we know that mammals increased after the dinosaurs went away because, like we said, the predators were gone, new niches were available, and there simply was more room now to have mammals around in the ecosystem. So they could get bigger and they could diversify and kind of hit their peak of diversity. You might think that now mammals might be at their peak, but it's actually not the case. They've been declining for about 2 million years, in large part because of humans, although humans haven't been around for that entire time. They've kind of been dropping off steadily as we've approached more recent times. As far as the groups of mammals, there are the Protheria, which are the most primitive of animals. These are your monotremes. Because there's only one living group of Protherians, you can almost use monotreme and Protheria interchangeably because there's only one group now. The Echidna and the Platypus are the only real two groups of Protherians. There aren't really that many of those left. The Therians are viviparous. They're going to give birth to live young. So again, these are subclasses. Class Mammalia, subclass Protheria, subclass Theria. The two living groups of Therians are the marsupials, things that have pouches, like these wallabies over here that are apparently either dancing or killing each other. I'm not really sure which one it is. But they give birth to young very, very early on and then have to support those young in a pouch or something similar. And then we also have the placental mammals. So your mammal taxonomy at a very broad level is based on, okay, do they give birth to live young or do they lay eggs? If they give birth to live young, how long do they maintain those young in the uterus? If they give birth relatively early, they're marsupials. If they wait and give birth later on, they are placentals. And both strategies are equally effective. They're both good. There have been peaks of diversity of both groups throughout the world, throughout history. In South America, there used to be a ton of marsupials in South America, just like there are now still in Australia. In North America, there were placental mammals. That's just kind of how history went with the evolution of these two groups. And so at one time, there was actually a mixing between the South American marsupials and the North American placentals, and there was almost like this big meeting and this big battle between the two groups. And of course, the placental mammals pretty much won, at least in this hemisphere, because there really aren't that many marsupials out there anymore in this part of the world. We've got possums here. There's a few other species down in South America, Central America, but marsupials are pretty rare now in the Western Hemisphere. All right, so here are your monotremes. Monotremes are very much almost like a reptile-like mammal. They're definitely mammals, but they're sort of erring on the side of reptiles, or even in some ways even like birds. They have a cloaca, for example. A cloaca is a term we haven't really seen too much yet, but in birds and in monotremes and in reptiles and in amphibians for that matter, cloaca is a common exit for fecal matter, for urine, for reproductive cells. It's a common exit. It's everything leaves from the same point in the body, and that's not really something that most other mammals have. These are not going to have the ability to feed their young after they're born, so the mammary glands are very, very much reduced. Nourishing the offspring after birth is pretty minimal. And there's only 3 living species, like we talked about before. There's a duck-billed platypus, and there are 2 species of spiny echidnas, which are also kind of in the same general part of the world. And of course, the very famous platypus up top there, which most of us are familiar with. I know I see my fair share of Perry the platypus, so I thought I'd mention him as well. The platypus are actually a fairly kind of cranky. That's kind of how Perry looks up there in that picture, actually. But male platypus is platypi. A male platypus has a venom gland on its back leg that it can use to kind of knock you out if you approach one, or if you try to mess with one. They can defend themselves pretty well. It's going to kind of set you back quite a bit if you try to mess with one of these things. They're not real cute and cuddly most of the time, but definitely very bizarre. All right, marsupials here. We have our North American marsupial, our common, what's technically called the Virginia opossum up here on the top with some babies kind of hanging out with it. Marsupials have a very, very temporary, very minimal placenta. Birth of the offspring happens at a very, very, very young age. Okay, so marsupials are going to have, it's barely even a fetus. It's an embryo or a fetus, a very young stage, born early on. It's going to try to make its way through its mother's fur and get into that pouch. And once it gets there, it's going to hang onto the nipple and feed for weeks or months after that. All right, so this is the marsupial strategy. This is one way of going. The nice part about this for the female is that birth is very, very easy. In most cases, it probably happens without her even realizing it, or at least a very minimal disturbance to her day-to-day activities because the young are so tiny. The drawback is that for these babies to get into that pouch, it's kind of risky. I mean, these things are like the size of a peanut, and for them to get from the birth canal all the way up to the pouch, which isn't really that far, you know, as the crow flies, I guess, so to speak. It's not really that far, but for a tiny, tiny little organism, it is kind of a ways to go. And so the bulk of their development actually takes place in the pouch. 2 strategies here for mammal. Number 1, give birth to young very early, and then sort of maintain them and allow them to grow once they get to the pouch. That's what the marsupials do. For the placentals, we're going to give birth much, much later on when the fetus is much bigger, and have a relatively short period of parental care outside of mom. Right? 2 different strategies to accomplish the same task. Down here you can see the joey of this kangaroo, a very large-sized animal, still hanging out in that pouch. And I actually know some people like that too, where the young kind of hang on to mom for much longer than maybe they're supposed to.